All right, let's get started about 20 seconds early today. So we're talking about three things like I mentioned earlier. We're mentioning how to restore a couple points from your prelude paper to your midterm paper, though I will not be taking points away from your prelude paper, but from a vast infinite store of points that all instructors have access to. That you can take points from and then give unto you if you meet certain obstacles and challenges. All right. First and foremost, let's take a quick look at the MLA format. So these are all things that you know. You all will, and I'll address some things that we did not do as well as we could have, but in a very pleasant way. That said, take this as an opportunity to note some features of the format, particularly if a couple things hit you, like you did not have the same font for your running head as you did for your body paragraphs, because your body paragraphs started with Times New Roman and your running head started with Arial. That's the sort of thing you were expected to see. Make sure that the spacing between your name and the page number is also simply 1, not 2. Make sure that you have a single double space between all 4 pieces of information that you have on your heading, your title, which is to be a descriptive title. It is supposed to tell me, your reader, something about what he, she, or they, or it are writing. And then also only a single double space between your title and the body paragraphs themselves. So notice all those single double spaces. If you're ever using not a single double space, when it comes to all of those, you are not doing the right thing. There's only one instance in which you really need single spacing. You don't need to do that. That comes from when, and I don't know if we have an example in here, when you use a when you use a block quote. And when you use a block quote is when you quote from another author, when you use a quote of 4 lines or more. Then you indent the quote, just like the beginning of a paragraph. You set it to single space. And I don't require this, but it's sometimes done that the font goes from size 12 to 11. So if you do use a block quote, make sure that you're minding that sort of thing. All that said, that's just a little bit of extra from today. So we're going through the body paragraphs. This is the first part of the text. The second part for you from the prelude paper was the works cited page. But between the works cited page, and make sure that you're saying works cited and just putting it very plainly like this, capitalizing the W, capitalizing the C, not in all caps, not bibliography. Bibliographies are philosophically different from works cited rather than those works which you have explicitly cited. Bibliographies are those texts from which you have drawn, you have written. And so philosophically speaking, bibliographies can be far larger than works cited, or a little bit more arbitrary in selection. But between works cited and the body paragraphs, section called notes. This is very important for us today. Notes is where you are going to put the information necessary to win a couple points back from your prelude papers. So let me do some of my famous drawing here. So for this midterm paper, these are your body paragraph pages, all 4 of them, and they're wonderful. Here is your works cited page. I call it WC. We're going to call these body paragraph. But here, between them, is your notes page. This is what's important for today. You will have noticed, looking at the comments on your prelude paper through Moodle on turnitin.com, that not only do I give you play-by-play notes on particular grammatical, syntactical, logical, formatting features of your essays, but at the end, I also give you a brief summary of the things that you can improve for your next essay. Most people got something like A, B, C, and D, maybe E and F. But what is the assignment exactly? I've told you all this formatting stuff. Well, if you have 4 comments in the summary section for how to improve your next essay, this is how you can do it. I need you to write the comment out. If it's A, please include the A. If it's B, include the B. If it's 1, 2, or 3, include 1, 2, or 3. But have the comment written verbatim like I wrote it so I can see what it is I said. And then after you've written out what the comment is, maybe it's something like need to outline whole paper in intro. Though I would have written it a little better than that. Include what I wrote, and then underneath A, write how you addressed that. Tell me how you improved your introduction on the midterm. Tell me explicitly. Tell me like I can't see. I improved my introduction by outlining what my 3 body paragraphs would have, would include explicitly, colon, A, B, and C. Let me know, tell me. Maybe B is something like cite your sources correctly, cite sources in proper MLA. Then you do so, and then you tell me that you have done so. And that is what I'm asking for from you. You can win up to 4 points on your midterm from doing that. For, I think, almost all of you, if not every single one of you, 4 points are very important. 4 points is the difference between a minus and a normal B, and a B plus, sometimes even a B and an A minus, 86 to 90 right there. We jump through a plus all the way to a minus. So 4 points. Don't turn up your nose at these 4 points. Also, these are 4 points that if you pursue them will improve your writing. To improve your writing, that is another way to improve your score. So look at these not just as ice cream at the end of the meal that I give to you to placate you and to make you sort of happy, but not really help nutrify you very much. Look at these more as like oranges or grapes. They have good carbohydrates in them. They are good for you, but they're also supposed to be something like a dessert, something that helps you, something that is a little bit extra. Okay, are there any questions about the formatting that I can get the formatting exactly right? People that do not do this right and clearly did not watch our video or show up for class are going to have trouble getting these extra points. So go the extra mile, make sure that you do it right. Any questions yet? If they come up, that's fine. Ready for Goethe? Yes. Yes. Yes.
The way it's set up, the word finding I see is after the notes.
Yes. 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 And always check this. This is the sample MLA paper from I think first week, and it says like I think it's called sample MLA paper, but it has the exact format. But yes, your body paragraph pages, the notes comes in between body paragraph and works cited, and so it's because we don't use notes, I'm reappropriating notes, making notes extra credit. Still call it notes. Still call it notes. Don't make any changes that I did not ask for. And if in your head something comes up that we didn't talk about, email me, talk to me, ask in front of the class. I'm sure everybody else will be thinking the same thing. Great question. Any other questions? Okay, let's conclude Goethe. And if more questions come up later, that's okay. Sometimes questions don't they don't keep schedule. All right. I know that you've already watched something of a conclusion, and we already got a more specific conclusion from our guest speaker on Acts 4 and 5 of Goethe's Faust Part 2. But I'm just going to say some things that we iterated and reiterated on Friday that I hope I hope to bring this work to an appropriate conclusion. I hope to wrap things up well. Good. I was thinking of presents. I'm already one holiday ahead. So note my subtitle. I don't have a subtitle for notes from underground, perhaps belying less developed thinking on it. But insofar as we do have the developed thinking, let's see what it is. A strange modernist masterpiece. Strange modernist masterpiece. Metamorphic impetus or systematic deformation. That's very interesting. That does remind me quite a bit of what we were talking about on Friday. Put a clue in to people that didn't make the forum. We talked a lot about whether this text, and I'll add Don Quixote to the list of texts like this, whether it is a text that features failed transformations. Does Don Quixote ever become a chivalric knight, for example. Does Faust ever completely finish the transformations that he starts of the economy, of the battlefield, of the land itself? Or is this a story of the finite nature of almost all transformations? That even when things change, they do not change forever. They're doomed to change again. And asterisk question, nice asterisk here from Astra, star. We have astral bodies and astrology and astronomy. Can a work truly be modernist if it fails? I guess it is interesting semiotics. I could say fails to transform, or it could be more visual. Doesn't that mean the same thing? Not interesting? Interesting. So, are these texts truly modernist at all if the protagonists in them do not succeed in transforming? They do not succeed in transforming themselves. They do not truly succeed in transforming the world around them. Are they ultimately impotent in their authorial, artistic, aesthetic desire to reshape the world in their images, to be something like an aesthetic or social or cultural father to a movement, a change in a way of being, rather than an actual physical or biological father to a child, as Faust almost was once and then twice. So once in the first part to an actual biological child with Marguerite, but then also to this very literary odd child, Euphorion, who is a representation of the great poet Lord Byron with Helen of Troy in the second part. Very good. All right, so just a couple of things that were aspects of this text. It is sometimes known as a romantic text as well as a neoclassicist text. We didn't talk a ton about romanticism, but we said that some major features of romanticism and this is a little bit different from, say, Romeo and Juliet, or what we consider romantic these days. When you go out, on a date, have some nice candles lit and like softly strumming Spanish guitar, and there's some sort of mellifluous smell in the air, and it's wonderful. That's what we call like romantic. That's not exactly what literary romanticism is. One thing is that romanticism comes on the heels of the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution that showed that, say, rationalism, often based on Greek philosophy and Aristotle, and later church commentaries on that, or scholastic commentaries on it by major figures like St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas, believed that the world and God and the cosmos could be understood by just investigating rational principles. By using this method of deductive logic, one could uncover the objective truth of the world. With the coming of Descartes and more empirical minded individuals, Francis Bacon, later David Hume, the scientific method starts to be developed. This method that is called empiricism. Empiricism is a method of trying. That's where empiro comes from. Giving something a try, for example, giving it a shot. Trial, for example, is related in that way. And so empiricism, one has to use sense experience and then inductively induce back to first causes. And so with the scientific revolution came a reduction in what humans thought they could understand about the cosmos. All of a sudden, this world of metaphysics, where God and the angels were, and the ability to objectively know it, disappears. Now, one lives in a much more subjective world, a world in which one is bound by one's subjective apparatus. You may have heard, there's a very famous analytical philosopher named Thomas Nagel who wrote an essay called What It Is Like to Be a Bat. And the essay is basically saying, well, even if you could understand a bat, you wouldn't have anything to talk to the bat about because the bat sees reality in a way that suits the bat. You could probably make the same claim about, say, your dog. There are certain things that you would understand about your dog, like warm, fuzzy feelings towards another mammal, But then there would be lots of like weird sensations tied to the fact that your dog can smell feces near it, as well as some urine, and all of a sudden feels the need to urinate itself. Something like that. The idea being that humans do not see the world for how it is, but they see the world how a human can see it. This is a debate that is ongoing. Are we capable as humans of seeing more than other creatures, of seeing beyond what the ants and the dogs and the elephants do? Obviously, that seems right in some ways, right? We have symphonies, we have language, we have submersibles that work often enough. No other creatures have these sorts of things. We eat way more sorts of things than any other creature. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. Do you know? You see how much more? So like there are lots of creatures that just eat the dirt. We eat everything. I mean, not literally, but very much closer to everything than any other sort of creature, and at least in terms of what it has access to. I think some creatures would try and eat as much if they could, but they can't cook, so that's a problem. In any case, Romanticism extols the subjective ideal and striving towards the absolute, striving towards some absolute notion of beauty or truth. This notion of the absolute you might tie to a degeneration of the role of religion in one's life. And in the sort of medieval world, striving towards the absolute was often striving towards God, or striving towards Mary, or in a sort of pagan way, striving towards one's lady love, which itself sort of an angelic figure, like Dante's Beatrice in the Divine Comedy. Now, striving towards the absolute itself as not an adjective, but a noun seems to have replaced that image. I think this bit of modernism, this bit of romanticism, is something that still exists in our own world. We still have very many people who strive for some sort of greatness, but what is greatness? Is that athletic greatness? Financial greatness? Is it philanthropic greatness? Is it curing cancer greatness? What does it mean to strive for something in the world in which we live? And what is the absolute? Is there such a thing? In any case, I mentioned the veils of subjectivity. So veils of subjectivity. These are the hindrances that all people have that keep them from understanding each other. So language. We don't all speak a universal language. It's really hard to communicate with other people. I don't know how many countries you've been to, but when you do not speak the language, it is so real. It is like the weather. You're uncomfortable. Even ordering some food, you don't want to bug somebody, and you're depotentiated. You realize that when you're walking around LSU, and you're just having some normal day, it's totally boring. You wish something new would happen. But when you want to go get coffee, you can kind of half annoyedly be like, I don't want coffee. The person's like, excuse me, you're like, I want a coffee. You're confident. You can get upset. You can get irritated, but you don't speak the same language. It's a very depotentiated. It's a very real feeling, knowing that you are now a creature that mostly causes annoyance to those with whom you come into contact with, rather than somebody that is socially suave, socially charismatic, knows what to do. Culture, obviously, this makes a big difference. Medium of art, is this film? Is this a play? Is this, I mean, obviously it's not film at this time, though there are films based on this. Is it an opera? Is it a work? Is it a novel? Is it an epic poem? Is it set to verse and terza-rima, which is Dante's meter, is also used at various points during the course of Faust. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the whole structure of human perception, the denial of nature. Romantics do not want to die. They don't even want to age. In fact, one very famous example of a young romantic who died young due to drowning is poor Percy Bysshe Shelley. Mary Shelley, Frankenstein's writer's husband. He went out in his early 30s on a nice ride, and then he died. Whether it was suicide or one of the other very many things happen when one goes out on a boat, we don't know. His chronicler wasn't there watching him. The camera wasn't on him, nor was there a camera present. Anachronistically in the 19th century. In any case, moving on to neoclassicism. So Romanticism is a huge part of Faust, and I want you to think about the romantic impulse when we think about the limitations of transforming or the failures of transforming. Is there something within the very notion of romanticism and its denial of certain aspects of human experience, like aging, that tries to itself deny something natural in transformation? Is aging a natural part of the transformative life of a human? Is denying agency attempting to deny then a part of the human experience, or an essential part of the human, you might say, ontogeny, which is sort of our growth from the beginning to the middle to the end? Do we follow sort of an arc like that? Neoclassicism is a little bit different, like the word classic or classicism. Neoclassicism should evoke Greek and Roman themes. And if one thinks of architecture, one should think like when one looks at our sorority and fraternity row, of pillars, of large Corinthian columns. And so neoclassicism is an attempt to reintegrate classical themes, classical myths from Greek and Roman antiquity into Western literature after the Middle Ages, basically after the fall of Byzantium, which was Eastern Rome in 1453. After they fell to the Ottoman Turks, there was a huge influx of Greek and Roman learning from the Roman East. Greek East is what we call it, back into Western Europe. Huge translation efforts occurred then, and Renaissance scholars started to learn not only their Latin, but also their Greek, started translating and retranslating Plato, Aristotle, major philosophers, historians, playwrights, epic poets from the Greek tradition, and infusing their ideas and art back into the West after these so-called Dark Ages. So neoclassicism is an attempt to reintegrate Greek themes and characters contemporary than early 19th century German literature, like a sausage, packed with allusion and reference to classical themes. This is particularly from Part 2, Helen of Troy, Chiron, the centaur teacher of Achilles, the mother, is very recherche bit of mythology there. Menelaus, the husband of Helen of Sparta, Helen of Troy, Helen of Sparta. Nereus, the father of the Nereids and grandfather of Achilles, the not hero, but I'd say protagonist of the Iliad, and of course Philemon and Bacchus, who were figures of hospitality from Ovid's Metamorphoses, who are killed at the end of Faust Part 2. A couple other things. Don Quixote was 2 parts. The second part being unplanned, and the second part has a strange relationship, altering, retelling, and fixing the errors of the first part. Faust also has 2 parts, and they appear to be totally different genres. Remember, the first part is this very interesting sort of Romeo and Juliet tale that's a little bit more complicated than Romeo and Juliet. Faust makes a deal with the devil in order to pursue experience because he lives a dull, scholarly life. He goes, he sees an image of Helen in a magical mirror, and then creates, and then takes a potion himself to become younger, and also has a potion fashioned, a sleeping potion, so that he can meet this girl, Marguerite, who he has seen, sort of like how Aldonza Lorenza had supposedly been seen by Don Quixote in Part 1. And he is going to give her a sleeping potion so that she can put her mother to sleep. They can consummate their love, and then Faust can feel a moment of enduring joy. Apparently, he does not feel this moment of enduring joy post-coitally, or coitally, as it were. He makes love to Marguerite. She becomes pregnant with his child. In fact, the major difference that we talked about on Friday between him and Don Quixote, and maybe a major difference, is that he does consummate his love with his 2 people that he becomes affected by, that he has affection for, Marguerite Gretchen, as well as Helen of Troy. Remember that Don Quixote never consummates his love for any figure. Even when he finds himself in bed with the child of the innkeeper, Maritornes, he maintains his chastity, and he asks, while he is within the Duke and the Duchess's home, that they not put any servant girls, young servant girls, around him, so he doesn't give it to lust. So note that Don Quixote and Faust are different in that respect, though they may be the same Though Don Quixote has no progeny, it doesn't seem to have ever attempted to have any. He has no wife. We don't see him attempt any lascivious acts. Note that Faust also never has a child. His first, let's call her girlfriend, Gretchen, becomes pregnant, does not bear the child. His second child, Euphorion, with this sort of mystical, favorite word of the course, phantasmagoric Helen, Euphorion, attempts to fly and then dies like a shooting star, falls, doesn't last. And so is Faust different from Don Quixote? Are they both fundamentally similar in some way? Are they both fundamentally similar in that they are not modernist protagonists who fail to revolt against the revolt? They attempt to revolt, but the revolt is ultimately limited or failing. This is the art that I'm to paint for you today. All right. The first part of Faust you might call a romantic tragedy. It ends with Gretchen's death, though she is assumed into heaven, so perhaps it's a comedy. But she's saved. How is this tragic? I think even if she is saved at the end of her life, or I guess the beginning of her death, the actions leading up to her dying still seem to be tragic. And this is a question we had difficulty with on Friday. It is a different version of the same. The question that we encountered on Friday was, how could Faust do so many things, be responsible for the death of Gretchen's mother, her brother Valentine, in some ways his own child through his lack of responsibility and support of Gretchen. Then also, of course, he becomes a war hero, so he's responsible for all the deaths that come against the king in Act 4 of Part 2. And then, of course, he's also responsible for the death of these truly innocent individuals, these old people, Bacchus and Philemon. And yet, he goes to heaven at the end of the text. It's bothered many of our students. I wonder if we might not also be bothered by the fact that Gretchen goes to heaven at the end of Part 1. I don't say that because I think she is less worthy, but I wonder if in a Jovian sort of way, Goethe, or the story itself, as it comes back down to us from the chat books, is attempting to placate the tragedy for us. These things that happened were clearly terrible, but she goes to heaven at the end, and so all is forgiven. So I wonder if our emotions agree with that portrayal. If we do think, all that tragedy that Gretchen went through that seems to have even destroyed her mind by the end, truly worth it because she becomes safe? Or is this itself a subtle attack against the promises of religion? You may be promised something wonderful after your life, but during your life, what are you promised anything? And Gretchen would probably have a slightly different answer to that than Faust. But that is what I wanted to mention to you about that. Does the awkward connection between the two parts in Faust make it more modern? So Don Quixote, the first part, is far less complicated than the second part. It takes place 10 years before, and recall also that the second part has characters from not only the first part, but also the spurious second part written by the pseudonymous Avellaneda, and that the second part also has characters that have read the first part, and that the second part was at least partially written as a response to the fact that spurious second part had been written. So the very rationale underlying the writing of the second part of Don Quixote was different from the rationale underlying the first. Well, Faust was written in at four different times by Goethe from various historical material, actual historical material, unlike the Cide Hamilton Vangeli material that Don Quixote, or that Cervantes mentioned Don Quixote coming from. And also it was published over 60 years or so. So by a vastly different individual. Young Goethe started this work, and old Goethe finished this work. Does that awkward connection between the parts I call them the Frankenstein monsters. You understand what I mean by the Frankenstein's monster? What's an image of Frankenstein's monster that we have in our cultural ethos? How do we think of it? It's like a man, but what's all over him? Stitches! So he's obviously wadded together, stitched together, and when you can see the stitching on something, does that usually, okay, here's a fashion question for you. Does that usually indicate high or low quality for a garment? Low. What? Low. You're not supposed to see the stitching, though. When you do look at it, it's supposed to be excellent. People who stitch extremely well, that's an extraordinary skill. That's something Italians are known for doing very well at opera, for example. So that's more historical. In any case, this is a clearly stitched together text. Is that what makes it modern? I'll ask you the weird question for you. Is your mind like this text? Like a Frankenstein's monster of things stitched together that don't necessarily all go together? Is that why you yourself are modern? In any case, not a long time to think about that. Think about it a little bit later on. Okay, I'm going to very quickly go through a theme that I think I see in the 5 acts of Faust Part 2. So Act 1, we start with the Emperor. We have paper money and the mothers. Also, charming landscape is at the geometric center of Part 1 and Part 2. It exists technically as part. It is in the section after Part 1, but it is not yet in Part 2. It is a limbic space. It is an intermezzo. It is itself a space that is supposed to be sort of like Eden, and a lot has been written about it, but it is also sort of a place similar or reminiscent of Prospero's home on the island in The Tempest. The Tempest, which was a very magical play by Shakespeare, and is often seen as a goodbye to the stage, that all the magic ends at the end of The Tempest, as if being a playwright is to be a magician, to produce illusions in front of people that entertain them, but do not tell them truth. But in any case, Faust meets this emperor. And note that the style, the genre of Part 2 is no longer a narrative style like a first-person a first-person tragedy that tells an individualist love story. That's what we get in the first part with very fast prose. The second part, we get sort of a huge procession. And I used the word once, but I'll use it twice today. Phantasmagoric, similar to the Cave of Montesinos, where we see figures from the past, mythological figures in front of griffins, old witch hags, mythological creature after mythological creature after mythological creature presented in front of Faust. And it is as if Goethe is demonstrating his massive learning to us during the entirety of Faust Part 2, which he worked on and off during the entirety of his life. So Faust meets an emperor, creates a scheme to create paper money. Money represents value, but is it a symbol for how art reflects value? Talk about this on Friday. Does money create the notion of value, or does it simply represent value? If I give you a piece of paper with 5 on it, have I created the value of 5? Or does it simply represent 5 somethings that I claim to have 5 pieces of 1 ounce, 5 ounces of gold, or something like that? Can art create something valuable in itself? Or is it simply something which imitates what has value? Art only imitates what has value. How can art itself have value? I want you to think about that. Because probably you spend most of your life looking at art in some way or another. Even if, like, say, you love looking at clothes. Clothes are art. They're beautiful art. If you look at album covers, if you probably all day long you're looking at things that are images or stories in some way or another, or even called stories. And so, is what you're looking at that is created by humans and now also by AI of value? And I'll just throw in an extra question. Do you think if AI created a piece of art, is it in fact art? Or is it mechanical production? And if it is art, does it have the same or greater value than human art? And if you say, obviously it has lower value, I want you to think about what it is that gives art value. for you then? What is it? And is it a romantic notion in your mind that you want the subjectivity of a human expressed to you, not something else? That should tell you something about how objective you are as a creature, if that is the way that you answer this question. In any case, for example, does a character have value because it imitates a person who has value? Is the substance of art its ability to imitate or to create? What's the difference? Consider the homunculus who wishes to be human. Consider Euphorion who strives towards the sun, just to fall to the earth. Consider Faust who experiences an elongated moment of joy outside, and then drops dead. We also have a descent to mothers, bringing back the ideal form of beauty to the emperor's delight. This, of course, itself itself represents the act of Faust writing this poem and showing it to us, but also showing it to the Holy Roman Empire's court, later the German court. The poet, the artist, seeks after some notion or image of absolute beauty, ingests it in some way or another, and then retranscribes it for those in his society to observe themselves. Very interesting. In any case, Act 2, we see the homunculus and pageant of Greek mythology. I'm only going to say a couple things about this, which are that a homunculus, that is a Latin term based on homunculus, very like humanus, which is a late Latin word for homo, like Homo sapien, which means human. We are hominids. If you look at our scientific term for the sort of creature that we are. So a homunculus is a human-like creature that is created in a retort by another scholar, Wagner, the friend of Faust from part 1. This homunculus has quite the personality, and he really wants to come to be in reality. So he is somewhere between imaginary and real, some limbic space. But let's see, flit about from hill to hollow, and in the truest sense, I'll gladly be. I'm so impatient now to smash the glass, only so far given what I can see. I wouldn't want to do it in this past, but in confidence I confess I was on the trail of two philosophers. All I heard them say was nature, nature, I'll not part from them for anything. They must know about earthly being. In the end, I'll find out too. The cleverest place to travel to. So the homunculus wants more than anything to be, to exist, and yet it will fail to. So this places human experience as the what of reality. If a homunculus, which is a creature like a human, wants more than anything to be a human, where does that place human experience? Pinnacle of all experience. It's almost as if it doesn't matter that there is a subjective, non-objective aspect of human experience, because humans seem to be able to experience something like absolute beauty or absolute truth in a way that they can express to each other to prove that they have that capacity. And the proof would be something like a great poem or a great work of art. In any case, this homunculus fails. He fails to achieve this. And we have another failure in Act 3. Faust meets the legendary Greek beauty Helen of Troy, who set off more than 1,000 ships from the Greek areas of the Peloponnese onto Near Eastern Turkey, where Ilion was, and there was a huge war called the Trojan War fought for her. The Trojans eventually lost. There's Troy who stole her, was killed, as well as many other Trojans, including his nephew, Hector of Troy's son, who was dropped off the battlements. His name was Leonax, protector of the city, very ironic name, sadly. But Faust here has the chance to enter a relationship, romantic relationship, this now more like our contemporary sense than the 18th century literary sense, with the ultimate beauty from art. So, a question that immediately jumps to one's mind is Helen supposed to be representative of just a very beautiful woman, like flesh and blood, natural woman? Or is she representing an ideal, that Faust is aiming towards. And if she represents an ideal, like an artistic ideal, what does it mean that he has a child with her? A child with her that attempts to fly and fails. What does it mean for, it's like he sees something, he sees the mothers, they're like an image of absolute beauty. Helen's like an image of absolute beauty. It's like he mixes with her in some way, right? He absorbs, he's an absorber, he's not a blob, but they come together as one and create something. Create something which fails. Is this Faust Goethe's attempt to create art which transmits immediately a notion of absolute beauty or truth and the necessary failure that entails the attempt? Because of language, culture, religion, all the distinctions that we mentioned, these veils of interpretation, is he, like any artist, doomed to fail in his attempt to translate to what it is that he has seen? Seems like yes, but how could an artist, how could an individual, how could a person ever see the absolute, whether it be truth or beauty? Sometimes the Neoplatonists make them all one, in the first place. Wouldn't it have needed to be translated by another artist or thinker to have been witnessed by Goethe himself? Or is it itself an image that is developed over time through many subjective experiences that start to create something like a Frankensteinian objective whole when it comes to our worldview? I have something written here, I'll ask this too. Is the failure of mixing two traditions together to create something eternal itself the modernist problem? That's a pretty good question. Is Goethe failing to integrate Romanticism and Neoclassicism that are present in his culture together? And is he failing? Is this a problem not only of art, but of culture? Are there cultures that fail to mix? That attempt to create a new unity through something which is non-uniform, but fail to? And is that what Goethe is showing? I wonder. This is sort of a huge question when it comes to Dostoevsky's work. We're getting to Dostoevsky, the Russian author. Dostoevsky, the Russian author, whose characters are often European educated. Russia is in Europe and in Asia, but they're often educated in Western Europe, bringing Western European, often German ideas, philosophical ideas, back to Russia, and then want to create social change in Russia so that Russia becomes more like Western Europe. And yet, there's pushback with these characters because is Russia and the Russian spirit same as Western Europe? Is this attempt to bring the ideas and values of one culture into another, one that will simply happen without conflict? Is it something that can happen? Or is it something that is doomed to bring out a clash in consciousness, in culture, and between people? I wonder. Well, okay, very quickly, Act 4 encounters Faust helping militarily with the emperor. I suggest this shows the limited nature of empires, that empires exist in time and in space, and that their time often ends and their space often is taken by other individuals. Something that Goethe saw in his own life was he saw the American Revolution, he saw the French Revolution, and he saw his own native country, the Holy Roman Empire, become Germany. So he knows the geopolitical boundaries are limited, not only in terms of space, but also in terms of time. And so when a new universal empire comes, Virgil had Jupiter, king of the gods, say about Rome that he gave them imperium, power, legitimate power, regnal power, without limit in time or space. And yet, what do we know about Rome now? It's gone. It exists on the back of paper money and as a very nice place in Italy to visit nowadays. And so Goethe saw himself that the promise of eternal empire is itself more of a claim than it is truly a promise. And that things that seem, I mean, can you even, this is just a thought experiment for yourself. How many of you have ever thought about whether America will ever fall? I mean, I want you to really think like, how many of you think, I honestly think it will never fall? Like, I think English will be one of the most widely spoken languages for all time. And that basically democracy will win and that things will never change. Now, you don't need to answer that question. But probably a lot of the cultural, political forces that have helped to form the democracy, freedom, capitalist economy, are things that feel like they could never be different. And yet, what do you see in this text? That they're inevitably going to be different at some time or another. So this is supposed to free your mind to some extent, to pull, to, let's see, unhitch something. So that that which was static can be mobile. I won't say too much more than that, but the final transformation is in Act 5, when Goethe's Faust, like the Dutch, develops the capacity to retrieve land from the water. He's given a very marshy bit of land as a recompense for the things he's done to the emperor. A little bit of subterfuge there. I'll give you some land, very primo land. It's not primo land. It's like it's like somewhere off the coast of Louisiana, right before a hurricane. You might say it's not great land, and so Faust has to work to reclaim the land from the water, and he creates this using the scientific principles, industrial principles, creates this water this sort of plant thing that takes the water out and exposes the land, and then his land becomes valuable. In so producing this technology, Faust realizes that he has done something that will help people for generations to come. He experiences a moment of elongated joy. In experiencing a moment of elongated joy, he has fulfilled his part of the contract with the devil, which is the devil said, I get your soul as long as you get a moment of, I said elongated joy, enduring. But when his soul leaves his body, where does Faust go? Not hell, as we would have expected him to go to the entire time, but instead heaven. And he supposedly sees the eternal feminine as he goes up there. Has he been searching for the eternal feminine the entire time? For this image of Helen in part 1, and then Marguerite Gretchen. We're seeing this image of the mothers, itself a very feminine, perhaps the most feminine image. Perhaps you will notice, in the Catholic tradition, there are two major feminine images, but one is the mother. Do you know what the name of the statue of the mother holding the son, dead and broken on her lap, is called? Sort of statue. Oh, are we in Louisiana? How long have I known you? It's called the Pieta. These are where Mary's like sitting there, and Jesus is on her, on her legs. A very powerful feminine image. You might say that that's the image that all mothers have to confront, because what is it they know about their children? That they're doomed to die, of course. And so that's a powerful image. That's a powerful image for anybody. In any case, is that itself a failed transformation or a limited transformation to create life, knowing that the life is what? Doomed to die, mortal. Tack on question. Is anything created biologically or artistically immortal and unlimited? Is that the problem that Faust runs up against? End of lecture. End of Faust.